learning and law. These three are the most precious heritage of the Commonwealth, but the greatest of these is law. Certainly, there are fields which over my professional life I've come to know and appreciate the work of the Commonwealth in language, learning and law, and of its Secretariat in the former Royal Palace of Marlborough House in London. There are nearly 100 associations that have the word Commonwealth in their name. They bring together professional, institutional and other colleagues whose nations have substantially shared the experience of British rule and institutions. The Commonwealth Parliamentary Association, for example, taps the deep reservoir of experience found in the legislatures of the Commonwealth of Nations. Because one of the core values of the Commonwealth is accepted to be electoral democracy, it's natural that the nations that substantially follow the traditions originally derived from the British parliamentary legacy should find utility in an ongoing conversation between parliamentarians of the various Commonwealth countries. The affirmation agreed at the CHOGM conference in Trinidad and Tobago in 2009, apart from establishing the EPG, contained an extensive elaboration of the belief of the Commonwealth in the inalienable right of the individual to participate by means of free and democratic processes in shaping the society in which they live. Of course, today, such legislatures also participate in the Interparliamentary Union, with its broader global membership and operation. However, there's something especially comfortable and friendly in a meeting of personnel who share a common language, common history, many common institutions, common laws, common traditions and interests. Often these are unspoken, sometimes they're even unconscious, but enough survive to make the dialogue capable of proceeding without as many adjustments for the differences that exist as would have to be recognised in United Nations and other international circles. In addition to ministerial and governmental bodies, professional and governmental bodies, the regular meetings of ministers with similar portfolios, very large numbers of civil society organisations have flourished in the Commonwealth and set up representative bodies. And one of these is the Royal Commonwealth Society, which last year conducted a so-called Commonwealth Conversation. This was an extremely hard-hitting, candid, disparate and impressive dialogue, I think unexpected for a body like the Royal Commonwealth Society, and it identified what was wrong with the Commonwealth and how Commonwealth citizens might go about trying to improve the Commonwealth. A repeated failure of the comments that emerged was a criticism that the Commonwealth is just too timid, that's the problem. That, quote, the Commonwealth isn't serious about human rights. Quote, that it must be more articulate and forthright in declaring what its values are and establishing frameworks to hold member nations and their citizens to their obligations of upholding the shared values that are proclaimed at the regular meetings of CHOGM. There have been a number of investigations of the ways to revamp the Commonwealth to improve its institutional structure. A common theme of the past inquiries has been an emphasis placed on the need to improve the performance of the Commonwealth Secretariat in London. This was recognised by CHOGM in 2009 because part of this Port of Spain affirmation expressed a demand for, quote, efforts to improve the Secretariat's governance, its responsiveness to changing priorities and needs, and its ability to enhance the public profile of the organisation. We commit ourselves, said the heads of government, to supporting the Secretariat in this endeavour. We also underline the importance we attach to intensifying the Secretariat's commitment to strategic partnerships with other international organisations and partners in order to promote the Commonwealth's values and principles, end quote. By the standards of other international agencies, leave aside the United Nations and just look, for example, at the less effective French equivalent, Francophonie, the Commonwealth Secretariat is very small in size, diverse in background and varied in experience. Observers sometimes complain about the variability of performance and the inordinate delays in addressing communications. Whatever the reason, the need for improvement of the Secretariat is clear. The inability in the Royal Commonwealth Society poll of 2/3 of those interviewed to name a single activity of the Commonwealth that the Commonwealth undertakes was especially discouraging. At least one might have expected citizens to name the Commonwealth Games. The ways forward for the Commonwealth renewal was suggested in part by the CHOGM leaders themselves in establishing the EPG, affirming the Commonwealth values, and in part by the suggestions of the Royal Commonwealth Society and other commentators. Common themes for proposals include the need of the Commonwealth to prioritise its activities more effectively, the need to concentrate on those activities that the Commonwealth does best without repeating activities done elsewhere in the United Nations, the G20, the OECD and so forth, the need to avoid the delusion that the Commonwealth can be a global fulcrum of political, business, educational, economic, human rights and development activities, the need to embrace greater openness in the bureaucratic style of the Commonwealth, which in some ways reflects the old colonial traditions of secrecy and non-transparency, and above all, the need to walk the walk and not just talk the talk of so-called Commonwealth values. Several countries of the Commonwealth have been seriously in default of their maintenance of the core values of electoral democracy, independence of the judiciary, adherence to fundamental human rights. Rwanda, with its current election, where the leaders of the opposition are locked up, Malawi, with its judicial breakdown, the Maldives, with its response to gay and other issues, the arrest in Singapore of a journalist who was criticising the death penalty, and so on, come to mind. In repeated meetings of CHOGM, the leaders of the Commonwealth governments have attempted to state the values for which the Commonwealth stands and which are guaranteed for their citizens. In 1971, at the Singapore CHOGM, it affirmed a very strong stand against racism, and particularly apartheid, then dominant in South Africa. There is little doubt that pressure from the Commonwealth and facilitation by an earlier eminent persons group hastened the demise of that regime and the return of democratic South Africa to the councils of the Commonwealth. In 1991 in Harare, in happier times for Zimbabwe, the Commonwealth Declaration contained an assertion of the centrality of, quote, democracy, democratic processes and institutions which reflect national circumstances, just and honest government, fundamental human rights, the rule of law, independence of the judiciary, freedom of expression, and the enjoyment of such rights by all individuals, regardless of gender, race, colour, creed, or political belief. These statements were in turn affirmed in 1995 by the Millbrook Declaration during the Auckland CHOGM. That declaration accepted the need for improved machinery at the top level in the Commonwealth, and that led in turn to the subcommittee of foreign ministers called the Commonwealth Ministerial Action Group, CMAG. It was hoped that CMAG could respond quickly to perceived dangers to or departures from the declared Commonwealth values. This body was said to be, quote, the custodian of the Commonwealth's fundamental political values, end quote. However, whilst it has been partly effective in responding to military overthrow of elected regimes, as in Fiji, or to serious infractions in democratic elections, as in Zimbabwe, CMAG has been far less effective in investigating and responding to persistent abuses of civil, political, economic, social and cultural rights for all. So sometimes, despite the rhetoric, the inhibition of non-interference in domestic affairs seems to have been at work in the councils of the Commonwealth. Yet if that rule had still prevailed in the Commonwealth, South Africa would still be an apartheid state. This, therefore, is the challenge that currently faces the EPG. Although the United Kingdom is a nuclear power, it has neither the means nor the will to assert or reassert imperial rule. On the contrary, the United Kingdom has never had the fascination for the Commonwealth or its former imperial legacy that many had in the Commonwealth nations themselves. the growth since 1949 of countless international agencies and groupings, of the power and influence of the United Nations, and of economics as a precondition to good governance and effective achievement of human rights makes the challenge before the EPG a very large one indeed. Nevertheless, if we look to those times in the past when the Commonwealth has been most effective, they would undoubtedly include the times when the Commonwealth could somehow agree on a significant moral cause based on the Commonwealth's declared values, founded in the essential notions of human dignity shared by people everywhere. The Commonwealth was never stronger than in responding to the oppression against people on the ground of their race in southern Africa, first in South Africa and later in Rhodesia, Zimbabwe. The question now is whether, grounded in strong and repeated assertions of fidelity to universal human rights, the Commonwealth can recapture the same unity of purpose around basic ethical principles, and whether it can revamp its institutional structure to ensure the attainment of the goals so eloquently stated, restated and stated once again in successive CHOGM declarations. If the Commonwealth is simply to be a congenial club of mostly middle-aged men who attend a meeting every second year, enjoy the royal ambience, and then depart to continue oppressive regimes, it will probably fade away, perhaps deservedly so. Yet that would, in a sense, be a tragedy for the utility of the official, professional and other shared experiences of the Commonwealth facilities, though many of these could possibly survive the winding up of the institutional structure. The utility of having an organisation of 54 states of different sizes and degrees of power, which can meet together regularly in comparative friendship and harmony and share experiences and viewpoints on a basis that formally at least is one of equality and mutual respect, has a special value. One ethical issue upon which the Commonwealth of Nations has evidenced a very obvious blind spot is a most peculiar legacy of British rule. I refer to the anti-homosexual laws that remain in place in 41 of the 54 member countries of the Commonwealth. In our world of nearly 200 nation states, only 86 today still criminalise consensual same-sex adult conduct in private, and nearly half of those states are members of the Commonwealth. This is because the common and statute law of Britain in colonial times imposed a Christian religion-based criminal offence for such conduct and imposed it throughout the whole empire. Napoleon's codifiers, interestingly, abolished the offence of royal France in 1803, and the result of that action was that those countries which derived their penal codes from the codifiers, France, Spain, the Netherlands, Belgium, Germany, Russia, Scandinavia, never exported the sodomy offences to their colonies. So this was a peculiarly British export. And whereas the United Kingdom and the older Commonwealth members, like Australia and New Zealand, have repealed such laws during the past 40 years, they remain firmly in place in most developing countries of the Commonwealth of Nations. Half of the nations of the world that criminalise such conduct are members of the Commonwealth, and most of the remainder are Islamic states. Reforming a national system of administrative law is difficult, as I found during my service in the Administrative Review Council of Australia between 1976 and 1984. Yet at that time, at the federal level in Australia, huge and beneficial changes were made under the successive Whitlam and Fraser governments. They had very strong and resourceful and determined parliamentary champions. Parliament enacted the Administrative Appeals Tribunal Act, the Administrative Decisions Judicial Review Act, the Ombudsman Act, the Freedom of Information Act, and many other laws and policies were adopted. The reforms have endured